those who I have not had the chance to meet, I am Thais Carter, the Director of Strategic Initiatives here at Princeton Theological Seminary. And one of the great joys of my job is the opportunity to take all the really fabulous work that our faculty are doing and find ways to connect that with new audiences and people who might never find themselves in a theological classroom. So it is with that in mind that it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here and all of you joining us virtually to tonight's conversation, which I know will not only be interesting, but will be one of deep importance. It feels like every week brings a new headline that underscores just how important Kimberly Wagner's research is for this moment. For those who don't know, Dr. Wagner is the assistant professor of preaching at Princeton Seminary, and her new book, Fractured Ground, Preaching in the Wake of Mass Trauma, is a text with so many different threads to pull on that we hope that we can have this conversation lots of different ways with both people of faith and people in the world to think about how trauma influences our storytelling, our relationships to one another, and our relationships to God. As many of you know, tonight was intended to be a conversation with Cody Keenan, the former speechwriter for President Obama and author of Grace, President Obama and 10 Days in the Battle for America. He had to pull out due to an emergency commitment, but in doing so, that did allow us to move up a discussion that is equally exciting and relevant. Tonight, we have with us J. Paul Hines, Assistant Professor of Pastoral Theology here at Princeton Seminary, and author of A Gift Grows in the Ghetto, Reimagining the Spiritual Lives of Black Men. You can read more about both Dr. Wagner and Dr. Hines in your program, as well as their book or books. But tonight, the hope is that together, Dr. Wagner and Dr. Hines will explore how each of their important manuscripts sheds light on the ways prolonged and acute trauma shape and break narratives, and the way we might be better stewards of our stories in light of the very real challenges in the world around us. Thank you all for being here, and with that, I will turn things over.
Thanks so much, Thais. And J. Paul, thank you so much for engaging this conversation and agreeing to move it up to this date in the last minute. So I'm really grateful. And I'm excited for the kind of intersection of our work and our conversation. I guess it would make sense for us to start with just kind of thinking about our books, our work. And I want to hear a little more about what inspired you to write A Gift Grows in the Ghetto, and kind of what were the questions that drove you to do this important but challenging work?
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me, Kim. Of course, I'm not Obama's former speechwriter, as you can tell.
Way better, way better.
I think I'm a little better looking than he is, but don't tell him that. What inspired me? You know, this is a lifelong journey for me, questions that I've asked since I was in my youth about what does it mean to be a black male in this society, this particular context. What are the challenges that go along with trying to develop and find out who you are? Or the spiritual challenges that go along with that, trying to gain some sense of trust, because we say things like, well, trust God and believe in God, but these things aren't given. Like certain experiences kind of make us almost like a parent you've been taught to fear. You know, if they come around, you kind of flinch a little bit, or you hang your head down, or some other physical sign of shame that you exhibit. Some of us have the same thing in our faith lives, in our faith relationships. You know, God is the angry father that's coming to try to get us. And so we have to try to reestablish that relationship and grow in faith and grow in trust. And of course, in the African American context, the black church is oftentimes a place where we think this happens, but that oftentimes is not the case. In a class right now that I'm teaching, we're reading James Baldwin's novel, Go Tell on the Mountain. And you hear about his challenges in his faith development. So much of his self was restricted due to his sexuality and his race and so forth. So these are some of the challenges that many black men face in the black church. And then by and large, I think in the conversation we'll have a little while later on, you know, this whole idea of, you know, where is my home? Trying to find a sense of home. It's kind of shocking to think that I've lived in Princeton, New Jersey longer than any other city except East Orange, New Jersey in my whole life. I lived here in total of about I think, 11 years now.
Is that right?
And it still doesn't feel like home to me. I think I've come to a place I don't think it ever will. Not because I wouldn't like to be home, it's because I'm sure, not in this context, of course, but if I'm walking down Nassau Street, a certain time of day, it's a little dark, depending on who's walking down the street at that time. You know, there are some people who I'm sure they think in their minds, like, what is he doing here? Isn't it too late for him to be around here? Or things of that nature. This kind of sense sometimes that you're not in your rightful place. So those kind of things are what I thought about, especially not with myself only, but I have 2 sons and kind of some of the fears that they're experiencing now. The stories that are in the news that we'll discuss, you know, what does it mean to grow up in a place and know that you make a simple mistake, your life can be taken away just because somebody knows or wants you to know this is not your place, this is not your home. They're just trying to reinforce that in various ways all the time. So those are kind of some of the concerns I had writing the book, and some of the ways I thought it could be resolved is by emphasizing that we have to reestablish our gifts and come in reconnection with our gifts. The number one thing I think a gift is for young black men are healthy relationships, not only in community, but those spiritual relationships that help you figure out who you are and give you a greater sense of self, particularly in environments that some of us have to live in, whether it's the inner city or various forms of life's wilderness that we go through. So those are kind of some of the concerns that I had.
Yeah.
And I tried to work out in the book as best as possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
So same question, you can't get away from it. Same question.
I can't run
Yes.
away? Okay, same question. No, so my work actually I've been able to trace it all the way back to kind of my first career. Okay. So my first life, I was a secondary life science education major, and I taught 8th grade Earth and Space Science in Cincinnati, Ohio, and worked in a school district with a lot of students who struggled with belonging, who were part of or being recruited for, in the 8th grade, the gang system. Yeah. And so spent a lot of times just after school working with students who were struggling with trauma, who were struggling with home, with place. And then I left there, went to seminary, or as my colleagues in the the middle school said, that teaching in middle school drove me to a life of prayer, which is not the case. But I did go to seminary, and during seminary spent a lot of my time working as a student chaplain at a maximum security women's prison in Atlanta. And it was there where I heard a lot of stories, and I think that's where I began to kind of sort through my own theological understanding of how do you speak into this, right? How do you answer these questions? You know, when somebody looks at you and says, does God hate me? Yeah. Well. Right? Or I don't, or cannot fully tell me their story because they can't fully tell themselves that story, right? And so, and then I went into a congregational setting. I graduated. It can be done, friends. And got ordained and worked in a church that I naively thought, it's going to be a trauma-free environment. I was very wrong. And I experienced a congregation who were lovely, but went through a lot of different types of trauma while I was there, but also certain events, particularly the mass shooting in Newtown, brought up traumas that were unresolved in the congregation. I just remember it kind of impacting. I served a church in southeastern Virginia. So they were far from Newtown, Connecticut, right? And yet some of the responses within the congregation felt very urgent, right? As if it had happened in our school, on our back door. And after some work and thinking and conversation, realized that they had been impacted by the shootings at Virginia Tech. And so hadn't ever talked about it, hadn't dealt with it, and had never been discussed in church. So then I go do my PhD, and I decide for just a little seminar paper, not my dissertation yet, just a seminar paper. I'm going to write about mass shootings and preaching, because that seems like a seminar-length paper. But I start to do the research for it, and there's nothing. There's just nothing out there. And so I go and complain to anyone who'll listen. My advisors, the librarian, sorry, Sarah, all of my friends and colleagues, and everyone said the same thing to me, well, maybe you should write it. And I said, well, that seems like a terrible idea. But it kind of haunted me. It was one of those things where the more opportunities kept opening up for me to explore this question of the intersection of preaching and trauma.
Yeah.
And so that's what drove me to that very much is I see my academic work as an extension of my ministry to the church. And so my writing has to, for my own sense of call, my writing has to address and speak to what's going on. And I have so many clergy friends who are saying to me, like, it's a mess, right? There's a lot going on. There's a lot of trauma I'm encountering, and I don't know how to speak into it. And so this first book is an attempt to think about preaching in the wake of mass trauma. So particularly thinking about mass shootings, any kind of mass violence, natural disasters, and public health crises, such as the pandemic. It's the first of what will hopefully be a few different efforts towards thinking about this. But one of the things that I think intersects our work is thinking about trauma in communities, thinking about resiliency, but also anytime there's a mass traumatic event, it is always fed by or exacerbated by or exacerbates or brings to light, right, these interacting traumatic realities.
Yes.
So so the work is there, and we'll talk, I'm sure, more later about what's next. But that's kind of where I'm starting the story.
Yeah.
So,
how do you think we could do a better job here in this environment, kind of getting students better prepared to deal with that kind of trauma in congregational contexts?
Yeah.
To me, I think there are certain students, not all, but there are certain ones that do think, I go to my first church and I could breathe now. I could take a deep breath.
Yeah.
Then
Well, and I thought that.
No. I mean, they do. And they don't understand that these are families or persons in the community who do have traumas they're trying to overcome.
Absolutely. They should take my preaching and trauma class. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm not, but not only that. No, I actually think what we need to do is we need to have more just open conversations about the trauma. And trauma is such a complex topic, right? Because even when we use that term precisely and well, it is covering the response to multitudes of different responses, everything from mass shootings to natural disasters to traumatic illness and loss to abuse to racism and white supremacy, LGBTQIA plus discrimination, right? So it has this kind of gift of being broad, but also challenge of being broad. And so one of the things I think is we can help students, help even our faculty, our fellow faculty members, our staff members understand kind of the breadth of trauma and then what it looks like embodied. Because I think we have a certain image of what a traumatized individual looks like or what a traumatized community looks like, and often it doesn't look that way, right? There is no prescription for it. And it embodies in lots of different ways. And so I think one of the greatest gifts we can give is just giving folks language to describe what is going on, but also thinking about how to respond to it. Yeah.
Well, I found out that one of the hardest things to discuss when dealing with trauma is just the shame of it all, and being honest about what really happened.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about personal experience. When I was in high school, I told the story to the faculty seminar we had a couple weeks ago. Now, I don't look traumatized, right? I look like I'm pretty okay. But there's a lot going on up here that you don't know about. When I was in high school, there are certain scars that remain that won't be healed. Sometimes there's events that we don't think if I tell the story, that's not that big of a deal, but for me it was, given where I was in my development. When I was in high school, there's a town next to East Orange called Bloomfield, and mainly a European immigrant town. East Orange was like 99.9% black at the time. And we always liked Bloomfield because they had better basketball courts than we had. So one day, this is in high school now, about 5 of us from the school decide we're going to go to Bloomfield and go to one of their courts. So we go there one day. Nobody's on the court, shoot around for about an hour or so, go home, no big deal. Decide, it's nice, nobody's around, we can play there quietly, go back the next week. That following week, there were about 4 or 5 of the local residents there, all male. So we maintain one side of the court, they're on the other side. No interaction between the two groups. They're down there shooting. Nothing was said, no dirty looks. Stay there for about an hour, go home again. All right, not that bad. A couple of weeks go by. We go out there the next time, right? I don't know what happened in those 2 weeks. Now, you would think they did something like maybe they locked the gates or they put a sign up, don't come here, certain during hours of the day. They may put a sign up saying, well, this is just for residents in our neighborhood, basically stay away, that kind of thing. Mm. No, they took the extreme step. They took the hoops down and they never put them back up. Mm. Now, I left that neighborhood probably 10 years after this happened. They never put the hoops back up. Mm. So this is how extreme that move is. We are willing to deprive ourselves of a benefit to let you know how much we don't want you here. Mm-hmm. So these are small events. There's psychologists have a term when they talk about development, especially African-American development. They call it dissonance. There's a time where, for most of us, when we recognize we are not a part of the fabric of this society. And it's a shock for many. If you read the autobiographies of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Richard Wright, W. Du Bois, they all had this dissonance moment. It's usually during childhood, and they can't forget about it. Those who live into their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, it's still a mark of shame they can't get over. But for many persons, they tell these stories in private. They don't put it out in public. So what kind of environment can we create when these stories can be shared without shame? Where it's not like, well, that happened to me too, you should be able to get over it. Or, all of us have gone through the same thing. Where, that doesn't affect how it happened to me. My individual response to it could be completely different. So creating environments where we can explore these kind of things, give voice.
Absolutely.
These experiences is very important. Part of overcoming the trauma, I think that's very important too.
Absolutely.
Especially for young men,
yeah.
To put it more pointedly.
Absolutely. And recognizing, because I think one of the lies trauma tells is that you are unique in your experience.
Yeah, you're the only one.
Right, you're the only one,
yes.
And you feel isolated.
Yes. And
you feel pulled away from
yes.
from help.
Yes.
Right. There was a study that came out about clergy seeking help, and it's the same idea of like my trauma is so deep because not only have I experienced this, but my congregation has experienced this too,
yeah.
and I've carried their stories.
Yeah.
That there was this sense of clergy experiencing the sense that they were beyond help.
Yeah.
Right. That there was no point in seeking out counseling. There's a great interview that one of the he's a wonderful United Methodist pastor who was in Newtown in the time of the shooting. And there's a great interview in a video series called Healing the Healers, where he says, I finally went to counseling like a year later, and I looked at my counselor and I said, I could tell you things that would make your hair stand on end, and I don't want to tell you this. And she's like, nope, that's why I'm here. Yeah. And he's like, are you sure?
Yeah, are you sure? Yeah, are you
and
ready?
It was that sense of my hurt is so deep, but I think this is part of the shame piece.
Oh, definitely.
I think it's also part of the lies that trauma tells about our that we are so now individually broken,
yes.
hurt, damaged, that nobody can understand us.
Yes.
And also, of course, and I talk about this a lot, and we've talked about this before, the way that trauma steals language.
Yeah, you can't talk about it.
Right.
You're not supposed to.
Putting that story together coherently takes time, and it takes practice in telling it, right? And it may never be a coherent story.
And that's the challenge for me because, not to make this too dark, but the younger that trauma starts, is the harder it is to ever put language around it.
Absolutely.
Now, some of you may not know this, but there was an article a few years ago in the New York Times, there have been subsequent stories about this following, about the rise of suicide amongst young African-American children. Children, not teens, children. There are stories of children, I'm talking about 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, who are committing suicide. And this is on the rise. Now, this is a societal issue. This is not just an African-American problem. This is a societal issue that we have. So, I mean, one of my issues is that when do we start teaching children to tell their stories, to talk about this kind of shame? And it's even harder because some of these shameful experiences are just rooted so much in the family. This is before they go to school, before they go to church. It's within the home that they're having these shameful experiences for various reasons. So when do we start? Are you going to sit a 3-year-old child down and say, come on, tell me
right.
what's happening with you? Can't
right.
you tell me what's going on?
Absolutely.
And they can't.
And they can't.
And they can't.
Yeah.
So when do you start? But something has to be done, though, because this is a unfortunate phenomenon that's becoming part of the lived experience of many African-American youth. It's not going away, by the way. So we have to figure out when do we start helping these children tell their stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I think the importance of faith communities having
Very
this
important.
conversation becomes really important, because if faith communities can model that, they can model that for parents who can then hopefully model that for children, right?
Yeah.
Or create resources for parents to bring their children for those conversations, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of my next question for you, is to think about kind of what do you see as the role of faith communities. Really, it's a two-sided question. What do you see the role of faith communities in addressing this kind of trauma, as well as how do faith communities sometimes exacerbate this kind of
I'm on the
trauma?
latter side, exacerbating.
So do we need another hour?
No. Things wouldn't go well if I had another hour. There's some that advocate a multi-systems model of addressing the issue, which is, again, the church can't do it alone. You need social services, you need families, you need educational systems, all working in connection. The faith community, its role, there has to be persons who know how to have these kind of conversations in a very honest way. And I'm going to say this also. This is why this might get me in trouble. You have to be very honest in the kind of hope you're instilling in the person you're talking to. For many of these young persons, children and teens, I hate to let you know this, but there is no miracle coming on the way. Right? For if you have a family that's coming from the projects in the inner city on Sunday morning, they're going back to the project when the service is over, and they're probably going back there again the following week. So there is no miracle, oftentimes. And that is why in my book I work on what are the ways that you can create a sense of livelihood, a sense of identity right there in that mess that you're in that wilderness place. Now, what are the connections that you can make with the divine in the wilderness? Not when you get out, because everybody can't get out, right? And unfortunately, for the story I use, Hagar and Ishmael, the option of going back to Abram's house is not an option either, right? Because that's a place of torment for the family. So what can you do, right? So start with, what are the small things that you can do today to make a difference? And one of the things that sometimes the only thing that's available to us are healthy relationships. Finding someone to say, you know what, you did something good today. You're loved today. You are beloved. Or somebody cares about you. These are the small things that gives a person hope. It also gives them a sense of identity, right? Now, another thing I'll say, I'm against a certain kind of conversion experience I think we oftentimes preach in our churches. The Bible story regarding Ishmael says that he was regarded as a wild ass of a man, right? God didn't try to change that in the story. Right? Read the story. Never changed that. Now, what does it mean to be a wild ass of a man with God? You ever think about that?
That feels like a lifelong quest, J. Paul.
Right? But, I mean, would we accept that? Is that good enough?
Yeah.
But we're always in the process of trying to train somebody into something. Get that wild ass
Fit
stuff out
them
the way.
into
In the
certain
mold. A mold,
yeah.
right? We don't want them to, but listen, to survive the wilderness, you got to be wild sometimes in that
Absolutely.
environment. But I'm with God, though. That's the point.
Yeah.
So how do we have these conversations, I think, is very important, and being very honest and transparent
Absolutely.
with the conversations we're having.
Absolutely. I think for me, the way I also think about it, so there's kind of two levels, right, of trauma happening. There's the individual trauma, and then there's the collective and communal, right? And so I think I'm so grateful for this conversation, because you definitely are honing in on that, individual, relational.
Yes, well,
But that feeds, right, communal and they feed each other,
Yeah.
right? They talk to each other. They influence each other. For me, I think a lot too about the role of faith communities in addressing collective trauma. It is one of the few places where we get a chance to engage the collective.
Yeah.
Right? I think particularly, shockingly, I think about preaching. But for me, preaching is really one of those few times we have the opportunity, preaching and worship, when we have the whole collective together to have a family conversation, to have a communal conversation, to name, give language to, address the collective trauma that's going on, right? Because the reality is that so often people, I think first of all, there's a few ways it shows up, right? One is people will just say, oh, I should check that at the door and not bring it in here. The second way is I'm going to come in here and wait for my miracle, right? The third way is I'm going to come in here and dump it everywhere and not explain what it is. Because I don't know what it is. And I think we're seeing a lot of that happening. I shouldn't say that. I have a lot of friends who are pastors in churches who are seeing a lot of that happening, especially post-COVID. Folks don't know how to contend with the trauma that was brought on by COVID. And so they come in and they get really angry about really silly stuff. And whether it's you moved the communion table 5 inches or you changed the flower arrangement or why does that child have hiccups, right? Like it's little things, but they get really angry about it. And so for me, I think one of the other roles that the church has is to foster these relationships in order to also address this collective trauma that we are dealing with that by nature pulls at the relationships of the community, right? And so I think we can't establish some of these, I think the two can help each other, right? By establishing good personal relations, we can deal with collective trauma, but also by dealing with the collective trauma that's pulling at the fabric of these communities, we can then nurture these individual conversations. So I think the church has a real opportunity here. I also think that it's a really hard thing to do.
It's extremely challenging.
Right? And so to me, it's this idea of how do you push a community in a way that they can receive it, but are also moving them towards this conversation, right? It's an ongoing, how do you shift the culture, right? From coming to seek your miracle to finding giftedness in the wilderness.
I don't know. I think you have to look for different models, sometimes beyond the walls of the church for how this happens. And again, I think it takes a real honesty and conversation. I think one of the problems is, to talk about the African-American context again, is when you have a community that's so traumatized, is not used to having these kinds of conversations, it makes it extremely difficult. Because you don't want to further traumatize a person on Sunday morning saying, come on, tell me about your trauma.
No.
Or in a pastoral care sense, tell me about your more trauma. Now, I will say this, when you were talking, I thought about the fact that there are many instances where the preaching that goes on Sunday morning does not match the care that's given by a pastor in private conversation. Right? There's a lot of pastors that preach a lot of stuff on Sunday morning, how God wants this done, and your family should be this way. And then in private conversation, when care needs to be given, it's something completely different. So that's the challenge, right? Can you preach according to the kind of care you're going to give?
Absolutely.
That kind of opens the door for a lot of different things to happen. Right. I wanted to kind of move the conversation along.
Let's do it.
The things that have happened in the last week. And traumatic events that are affecting different communities in different ways. I know a lot of thoughts and prayers are with Ralph Yarl, but I think, this is going to sound wrong, a lot of my attention has been on the gentleman who did the shooting. I mean, 86 years old, 84 years old, he's seen a lot. He's seen a lot of social change in this country. And I thought about, my mind went to after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, the riots that broke out all over the major cities across the country. And the director, Michael Moore, documentary film director, he says he was a child after MLK was assassinated. And at his church, they left church that Sunday and people cheered. Let me repeat that again, just in case. Right? While cities were burning and the nation was mourning, he said, he's traumatized by this to this day. So he couldn't understand what's going on. And people cheered while cities were burning. It's interesting to see how people handle a traumatic event like that. There are some people, and I'm sure this gentleman in some ways was wrestling with this, who will applaud progress publicly. Right? We're glad the equality is coming, but in their hearts, there's still like a fire burning, right? The expectation that a certain segment of the community should still be under us. A certain section of the community that they still fear and abhor. Now, I said that, I'm thinking about this man because if you read the story, he shot him once, and he shot him again. Now, 84 years old, how can you do something like that to a 16-year-old teenager, right? There are many ways. Now, I said, when I was a teenager, my trauma was, my dissonance moment was the hoops being taken down, right? For different people, it's different things, right? Now, there are some persons who are still waiting for that opportunity, right, to get their chance to prove that I belong here and you belong over there, right? Now, for some of us, and this is going to get into some people's skin, right? Most of us in here is not going to be a gunshot, right? But how many times do we walk across this campus at Princeton Seminary? There's a certain glance you may give to somebody. There's a certain place you won't sit. Or certain people you'll never talk to, right? Or there's a certain book somebody signed, I can't read that. That's too much for me. Right? It's the same thing, different ways. Sometimes the hoop, sometimes the gunshot, sometimes the glance, sometimes it's where you sit. How do we all participate in this every day, right? Some people applaud after the civil rights leader is murdered, right? Other people have their own other modes of participating in the same practices. So that's my concern, right? Because I know all the anger is going to be against this man, right? 84-year-old man. He's racist. How could he do that? It's terrible what he did, right? But we all do it in certain ways. Now, in my book, I made the argument that we can't make this a white-black problem because a lot of this happens in the African-American community itself, right? And they're trying to seek our own sense of righteousness and holiness, making other people feel unholy as though they belong. And I think, for me, Toni Morrison does a great job of this in some of her work, right? Complexifying who's evil and who's good, who's righteous and who's unrighteous. Yeah. So I think those are the kind of questions that what happened to Raphael raises for me. Not so much the person who did the act, but how we all, in some ways, participate in the same activities every day. Those kind of questions, to kind of keep the trauma going on in various ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's been a week. It's been a year.
In some instances, yeah.
We have had, in the United States, we have had more reported mass shootings than days in the year in 2023. That's a first. I'm one of those people that keeps track of those numbers. And yes, and this doesn't even fall under that reporting, right? No. But with Ralph Yarl. And to me, what this week has brought up, because there was that, then there was the shooting at the Sweet 16 party. There have been other shootings. There was, not long ago, was Louisville. And of course, the elementary school shooting in Nashville. Thank you. Yep. There was a shooting in Memphis too this week, if memory serves. To me, what strikes me, I share with you those kind of deep questions of what has shaped us so deeply that an 84-year-old man would shoot twice. Right? Yeah. You can't call the second shot self-defense, right? But not that you should call the first one either, but we won't get into that. What has intrigued me as I'm thinking about this is what is our response as communities? Because our initial instinct is always thoughts and prayers. Right? Yeah. And that's become kind of a joke, right? But the reason I think we do that, and we do it genuinely, I think sometimes, is because we need to distance ourselves from it. Yeah. Right? That there's a way to say kind of, okay, I've prayed for that.
Okay, so it's over.
I mean, because that kind of trauma and the questions it asks us to reckon with.
And that's the thing.
Right? Are hard. Yeah. And I talk about, my poor students are so tired of my concentric circles. I talk about concentric circles of trauma, right? That there are those in the center who are most impacted, then out and out and out. And that there's this kind of natural allergy we have away from the center. Yeah. And when we're on the outside, it's really easy to send in thoughts and prayers and stay far away. Yeah. Right? Not that I'm saying we need to show up at the door, but what does it mean for us to lean in and take seriously the questions that these shootings raise, the questions, what is the role of the faith community in this, right? What is the role of us as political actors, right? As citizens, as students, as professors, right? As staff, as a seminary, and to lean in is super hard, because everything in our being says, Thank God that wasn't my
Yeah,
neighborhood.
there it goes. Yeah, that
Right?
wasn't me.
And one of the first things I've noticed this, and this is just observational information, not research. Well, research, but observational research, let's call it that.
Yeah.
Is that after any kind of shooting incident, immediately one of the first things the news wants to get is shooter and motive.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And the reason I'm pretty convinced why we need motive so quickly is because it somehow makes the rest of us feel like, oh, well, that won't happen.
Yeah, but it's not me.
Right?
Yeah. Or I would never do that.
Or I would never do that. Or I would never participate in that.
Yeah.
I could not imagine my 84-year-old neighbor doing that.
Yeah.
Right? And so we kind of have this sense of we want to push. And so just the immediate labeling of this 84-year-old man as, well, he's just a horrible gunslinging racist.
Yeah.
Which, fine, but also, what is the culture and the world in which he lives, where he has been allowed to, enculturated to, what has his faith community done to form him to be an 84-year-old man who will shoot a 16-year-old boy twice, right? Like, and so I think these incidents always raise for me questions about our responsibility when it's not in our community. That's kind of where my head is next, right? This book, the Fractured Ground book, is really about like the emergency homiletic we need when it's directly impacting us, because you and I both know it's not a matter of if, but when. Preachers and pastors will need to deal with this kind of stuff, but the questions of like this past week or month have really been raising questions of how do we as people of faith, as faith leaders, lean in to the hard questions that is required of us if we want to take these things seriously. Because I don't think we have the luxury.
Not anymore now.
We do not have the luxury. Also, what makes it really hard is they come one after the other.
I
feel like, I said to somebody the other day, I feel like we are living, like every time I open the news, I am living like the first chapter of Job, where the messengers are tripping over each other to tell Job the bad news. And it feels like that to me right now. And when it's like that, it's really easy to, if it's not directly impacting you, to avoid and shut down. Or the other thing that happens is communities who are dealing with their traumatic event it becomes a competition, right? Who gets the resources, who gets the social attention, who gets the thoughts and prayers. And oftentimes it is richer communities, whiter communities who are able to vie for that. Right? And I mean, I remember before here, I lived in the south side of Chicago, and it would get so frustrated because if there was a shooting in the north side, it was front page news on the Chicago Tribune. There were many shootings on the south side.
Never hear about it.
And, well, actually, you may not know this, but on a Sunday paper, there's a column that just lists them.
But there's
it's just a tiny column in the back that is just the tally. It's literally like the death count, right? And it's horrendous. And so to me, what then is a faith community? What is that saying to people, right, about what trauma counts and what trauma doesn't? And what does it say to faith communities about how they respond to differing traumatic events?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with what we consider to be the human. Because I brought this thing up when we had a conversation a couple weeks ago. Sylvia Winter wrote an essay called titled NHI, No Humans Involved. And the story was around after the Rodney King beating. And that city went up in flames. The police department would go to certain neighborhoods, and if that neighborhood was burning down, literally, they would just say across their caller, their speaker, and so on, NHI, that was the acronym they used, and it meant no humans involved. And the reason they said that is they said, if you go to this neighborhood and something's going on, just let it burn. And of course, these were inner city communities. So what you're talking about, Kim, the south side of Chicago, is just the expectation. That's what goes on.
That's what happens there.
That's the expectation. My brother he used to teach in Philadelphia, and he taught in a charter school there for about maybe 4 years. He had to quit he gave it up. Exactly because of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
He just got tired of the stories, not the stories, but how the community reacted to the stories. Young women, young teenage girls being shot, nobody cared. Young father being murdered, school doesn't even talk about it. You know, it just became something that you were supposed to absorb and deal with. And no one at the trauma again, no one talked about it.
Yeah.
And you just got tired of being in that environment. It's the overall attitude that people have about these cities. You know, this is what's supposed to happen to these people because they're not really as human as we are. So they don't deserve the news. They don't put it on a list. They don't talk about it at all. And so I think part of the question you're raising is how do faith communities begin to challenge this? And what I found out, unfortunately, and some of the research that I did for my book is that faith communities sometimes are just as cold-hearted towards those in the community as those outside the community. You know, there were instances I found of preachers talking about how bad the men were in the neighborhood, or how the women should avoid them, or how they're no good. These are black preachers saying this now, right? Or telling people, don't interact. As a matter of fact, there was a study that was done. There was a church near a housing project in Detroit, and this is going to really get your ears up. So the researcher found out that the church that was near the housing project, they would feed those families that they came out of the church. They would provide clothes to them if they needed them. But his point was they wanted no relationship with those families, right? They'll take care of you, we'll treat you good, but we don't want to relate to you in any way, right? We don't want to acknowledge that you're just as good as we are. I think that's a common phenomenon often for churches in the inner city. And another problem is I think that a lot of people know that right now, for the more prominent churches, most of those families come from outside of those communities.
Absolutely.
And come in and go right back outside.
And go right back out.
They're not from the community itself.
Yeah.
So that's extremely problematic. And again, it comes down to relationships.
It absolutely. Yeah, no, I worked with a student once who pastored a church that had been decimated by Hurricane Katrina. It was in the lower ninth. And so also dealing with the racism of the recovery, right? And he said, I came in and I pastored during their, I think it was the 10-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. They still had no building.
Yeah.
They were still meeting in an abandoned mall. And he goes, and finally, I preached what I thought was a heck of a sermon. And he said, but then I realized I don't know. I'm not in that community. I couldn't, as much as I cared about those people, I couldn't. And he eventually left, right? Like, and that's not to down him in any way, but just to say.
People do try. They try.
People try, but if we're going to come in from the outside, that's going to require a very particular attention to the stories of others and lifting
those in
up
the community.
the stories of those in the community.
Yeah,
So.
that's very true. Yeah.
All right, we have some awesome questions. I think the first one's for me, but so I'll ask myself a question.
You want me to read it to you?
Yeah, would you like to?
Okay, here we go. You spoke about the isolating nature of trauma and shame. How would you speak to someone who needs the validation that their trauma is, in fact, unique?
Would you like to answer that one, or you want me to start?
Well, you can start. I'm trying to figure out how I go about this. The trauma
So,
is unique.
so I think what I want to I think I want to make a point of clarification, which is trauma is always unique because it is the subjective experience of a traumatic event.
Definitely. Yeah.
Right, and so we can all experience the same event
in different ways
and experience it differently. So the first thing to say is it isn't that trauma is not unique. Every individual, every community experiences the trauma from an event or experience differently, right? Like I would be curious to hear how your friends process the story of the hoops being taken down.
Oh, we didn't
right?
talk about it.
You don't, of course. Yeah. Well.
No.
Yeah.
I mean,
but I'd be curious because I don't know if it's impacting them in the same way.
Now I would be interested to see if they even remember it. At
Right,
the
that's what I'm
time.
saying. Like,
there's
a way that, so trauma is a unique experience. What I think the lie that trauma tells is that you are so unique that you are beyond relationship.
And that's how it's so related to shame,
and you are
too.
beyond, that's the shame piece, right? That you are beyond support, or somehow, for so long, trauma has carried, and the unique experience of trauma, the subjective experience, has carried this stigma of it somehow is a sign of weakness.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so just to say that I think that people's experience of trauma is unique in the sense of it is a subjective experience of an event. And so in our conversations, in our relationships, as we're thinking about preaching and teaching and worship, we want to attend to that. But one of the things, the stigmas we want to break down is that you are so unique, that you are beyond conversation, help, support, and that there are other people who share the experience, even if they aren't sharing the exact kind of trauma, or they're not having the exact same traumatic response that you are, that they still can share in that conversation.
Yeah, but see, a lot of this goes back to our experience, our caregiving experience during infancy too. There's a famous study called the Still Face study by a child psychiatrist named Ed Tronick. And what he did, I won't put the table of terms, but what he did, he had a mother and an infant in his lab. So they let them start with their regular interaction. The baby's cooing and trying to get the mother's attention. The mother responds with excitement, right? Does this for a couple of minutes, then he tells the mother to switch, right? So the mother turns around, turns back around, complete still face, right? Now, most infants, what do they try to do? They're still going in the same mode because that's what worked before, right? I carry on, I coo, I make my faces, and mommy's gonna respond. All right. The baby does this for a couple of minutes, recognizes it doesn't work. What do you think happens next? It goes from that mode to anger, right? I'm crying, I'm flailing, I'm getting red in the face, I'm crying. The mother doesn't change her face yet, still a still face. There's one more phase for the child. What's the next phase? I'm going to act and respond the way my mother's responded to me.
Yeah, shut down.
Shuts down completely emotionally, right? Now, this is not just something that happens with infants and their mothers or the caretakers. This happens with young people in their overall environment as well. When you're experiencing something, your environment is always telling you it's okay, or you didn't really go through that, or it wasn't really that bad, right? Or we went through that too, and this is how we responded to it with the still face, right?
Yeah.
This is what they take on. So I think that's a problem too as well.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
How does the environment respond to it?
Yeah. Because also if we do that, then it kind of stays within us and feels more and more specialized.
Yeah.
To the point where we can't engage it in our relationships.
Yeah. Again, you never get the language to discuss it.
Yeah.
It's a complete shutdown.
All right, I have a question for you.
Sure.
You ready? What would you say needs to change in the ways we form leaders, given the realities of trauma in our personal and collective experience?
Great question.
So good.
And I have an answer.
You do?
Right? Yes.
Can I take notes or?
You might want to.
Okay, yeah.
So this is going to seem a little bit off base, but I taught a class last year with Mark Taylor on the Black radical tradition. I read a book by a scholar called Cedric Robinson. And Robinson is not a fan of leadership at all. He believes communities need to find some way of maintaining themselves without some kind of designated figure who leads. But Robinson also teaches that if you are going to be effective, one of the things you have to do is learn from the margins. We oftentimes in these spaces talk about learning from the great men and women of faith, right? The great theologians. But what Robinson is saying, when you're in a crisis situation, and you find yourself on the margins for whatever reason, right? You have to look to those margins to find out how people have survived in the past. And for many leaders, especially in the church, we never look to the margins. We're trying to save the margins. We don't think the margins have something to give us to be saved, right? There's ways people have survived for centuries.
Yep.
Cultural symbols they've used, ways of faith that they've discovered and used that help them to survive traumatic events. Slavery, Jim Crow, living in the inner city, wherever those are, right? Are you willing to open yourself up to learn from these spaces? For most of us, we aren't. And I think even times places like this kind of hinder us from learning from these spaces as well, right? Because you're the MDiv from Princeton Seminary. What am I doing learning from somebody who's not educated, right? Probably can't read well, right? Probably has an 8th grade education, whatever the case may be. But they know how to survive and thrive on the margins.
Absolutely.
So I think that's something that's integral to leadership. Right?
I
Not always
agree.
looking above, but looking below.
Absolutely.
Which,
Yeah.
by the way, I think Jesus modeled anyway.
Absolutely.
Now, who did Jesus spend his time around?
Yeah, I think bringing in the voices from the margins.
Yes.
I think also being honest. I think one of the things that will help form leaders who are trauma aware, trauma responsive, is to engage in reflective conversations with leaders who are being formed about their own kind of traumatic realities that they are carrying, and to help them to understand the experience of others, right? And that, again, is, I think we have a similar inclination, which is like leaning to the margins, which is to look at communities and people who are not sharing your story and hearing their story and receiving their story in a way that you can begin to recognize. You know, one of the things about collective trauma is that it also fights one of the greatest resistors of the divisions of collective trauma is nurturing empathy. Right? And nurturing the capacity to receive another's story without running away. And so I think if we can train leaders to be comfortable doing that, but also figure out how to nurture those conversations elsewhere, that becomes really, really important.
Like a practice that they maintain.
Absolutely. Which actually leads to our next question.
You want me to read this one? Or?
Sure.
Okay, having open conversations about trauma can be intimidating. What are some common mistakes people make in broaching this topic? You want to go first? No, I can't.
I don't have my chart.
I know.
So I think I actually, it's so funny. I start my book this way by saying there's 3 errors preachers are tempted to make, and I think it's true for anyone dealing with trauma. The first is to just bathe in it, right? To only think about the trauma and only talk about the trauma. This happens a lot to me. When I'm like traveling and teaching at conferences, it's like I've cracked open the door and people are just like telling me their trauma, and what they want is they think that their job is to just kind of wallow in it. And so one of the errors we can make is only staying on the brokenness side, right? And not thinking about how do we move towards not crushing it, right? How do we attend to it from a place that takes seriously redemption and resurrection, right? And so the first, I think, mistake is to just say, like, we're going to talk about our community's trauma all day, every day for the next month. Isn't everyone excited for worship, right? Like, that's nobody. You can't just sit in there. The second is the opposite, right? It's avoidance. Or it's just saying, look, everyone knows what's been going on. And so what they come to church for is that miracle, right? Or what they come to church for is resurrection talk. A person I adore who is a pastor on the south side of Chicago, and she's a brilliant pastor. I remember she and I had this talk because during the pandemic, one of their church members was killed by a stray bullet, a young woman. And they had to do a private service, right? Because it was COVID. It was like the height of COVID when everything was shut down. And I asked her, have you all, how have you addressed this in worship now that you all are back together? Oh, we don't. We haven't talked about it. And I said, well, what's the thought behind that, right? And I wanted to honestly know, because I trust she's a wise pastor. And she said, well, I feel like they all know. Like, we hear gunshots outside our church as we're worshiping. I don't need to bring it up, right? And so we talked a lot about it. And I don't think she was avoiding it, because sometimes avoidance is actually with the best of intentions, right? I think her intentions were good, that she thought, I don't need to tell them what's going on. They can hear it in the background, right? But I think by not acknowledging it and by only defaulting to, it'll be okay in the sweet by and by, right? Or it's okay, God's got it.
Yeah, that's another one.
Right? That when we just default to that without taking seriously hurt and pain, we also have made an error. And we are not inviting folks into that conversation in healthy and helpful ways. I think the kind of third error that preachers make is just kind of preachers, leaders make is talk about it once and check it off the list and move on. There's a way we want to say, like, we addressed that, right? Yep, we addressed that, right? We check, we can move on. And this recognition that these are ongoing conversations and they ebb and flow, right? And you don't want to sit and wallow in the conversation every Sunday, every week, but when the text invites it, right? When the news story invites it, right? like when the news story reflects something that has happened in your community, you know, and just thinking about those moments when the grief and the trauma, it actually makes itself available for conversation, that we ebb and flow and move with it and don't just think, we talked about it once, we're done, right?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I mean, my thoughts are pretty simple regarding my response to this. The myth of cure, I think, is very. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, you're speaking my heart language there.
The myth of cure. There's a therapist called Heinz Kohut, and he wrote an essay years ago called "That Care is the Cure." Care is the cure. I think oftentimes when we encounter somebody in their trauma, we're trying to get them healed quickly and get them back to normal right away and functioning again. Or the wilderness metaphor again, let's get you out the wilderness and get you delivered. They haven't learned their lesson yet. They got to go back in there again and learn what they were put in there for. So I think we don't emphasize enough, like the time that you spent in conversation, or you spend in conversation, the time that you spend trying to show some empathy, the time that you spend unpacking that story, the time that you spend trying to get that infant to get over that still face phenomenon, that itself, that's the cure. And sometimes that's the best that's going to happen. So are we engaging with others in such a way that we're really caring and not rushing to a cure? Now that's a problem, Kim, because the cure puts people in the pews on Sunday. All right? The cure sells.
Yep.
The cure is what people like to hear. But really the most effective thing that we can offer most times is just adequate, wholehearted care.
Yeah,
I think that really helps a lot with dealing with trauma too.
absolutely.
So that, the whole thing, care is the cure. I think it's very important in discussing trauma.
Yeah, and I actually resist even language I work to resist language of healing that is not sung in an eschatological key, right?
Yeah.
I talk a lot more about, I think we need to think about recovery and resiliency.
Yes.
Right? And thinking about those as opposed to cure, because cure also carries with it, cure and healing, carry with it this Western medical lie of, I was fine, I broke my arm, I had surgery, and I'll be back, good as new. Good as new. That language of good as new is so problematic, right?
It's not true,
And also the difference is, too, do we want to be the same? We are never going to be the same people we were.
No.
And do we want to be? Right?
Yeah.
So that's a real challenge.
Yeah. I'll also say this: the danger for me is that oftentimes we can give a cure when adequate care has never been given. Right? You can cure and redeem or resolve some kind of issue, but the person hasn't been cared for. Right? So some of those spiritual wounds that existed before are never even looked at and resolved. So I think that's problematic as well. The lack of care, but there's a lot of curing going on.
Do you want a question, or do you want us to both have a question?
It depends what the question is. Is it a hard one?
No, it's an easy
Okay,
one.
good.
All right. Dr. Heinz.
Yes.
You spoke about the importance of healthy relationships. How do you cultivate healthy relationships within traumatized contexts?
Okay, that's a long answer that we can't get into, but I will say this, that in...
Do you have a 30-second version?
No.
No? Okay.
35.
35? Oh, easy. Okay, great.
If you look at developmental theory, Erickson, right? There's two things I'm going to emphasize. You can't have a relationship, or you can't be intimate without an identity. All right, so I think that's the number one thing that needs to be established. Do you know who you are? Do you know what you have to offer? Do you know your boundaries? Do you know what things you're not willing to deal with before you can be intimate? Because oftentimes, if you don't have that identity, then whoever you're in a relationship with will completely consume you. All right? So you don't have any boundaries, you don't know who you are. So identity, need intimacy. And then also I think it's very important because once you have these things, you know what you can give. Not just to the person who you're in a relationship with, but also to the following generation. Because for Erickson, if you don't have an identity, you can't be intimate. What happens if you're not generative, you take everything on to yourself. It's all mine. Everything I've gained, not just financially, but anything you accomplish in your life is all for me. Nothing's left for anyone else. So I think number one, if you're trying to establish those relationships, and this is not an easy task because Erickson would say most of us never establish a healthy identity. right? Not because of race or because of sexuality, just all of us overall. That is the hardest thing we have to achieve in our development. Who am I? Be confident in this. And most of us don't do it. And that's why most of us don't have intimate and healthy relationships either.
Yeah.
Because we don't have an identity. So number one, you need an identity. And that's the hardest thing, by the way. I know it sounds easy, but it's the hardest thing. Yeah. Which nowadays, I don't know if some of you have heard this stage they had now called emergent adulthood, where before, maybe 13 to 18 now, I can be an adult, I can drive, I can do these other things. Now they're saying to your early, sometimes mid-20s, you're still struggling with adolescence. So now it's even harder. The expectations as far as when you get an identity is being stretched out. I'm sure years from now, be in your 30s. You still don't have an identity. So, I mean, it's very problematic. It sounds easy, but it's the hardest stage that we have to go through.
Yeah.
Getting that identity.
Well, and trauma always pulls at identity.
And that's the problem.
Right?
Because trauma affects who you are. Yeah.
Communal identity. And oftentimes, I think, and this kind of, well, we can end with this, but also I think that oftentimes communities get stuck.
But see, he also believed that we as a community never get an identity.
Right.
Like that, what does it mean to be American?
Right. What does it mean to be a Christian?
Yeah, all that kind of stuff, right?
Right. Like, and I think a lot of times communities who are experiencing either ongoing trauma due to racialized violence, right, and discrimination, or experience, a natural disaster, a mass shooting, they their whole identity gets shifted. Yep. It gets fractured is the language I like to use, but also the community is tempted to get stuck at that point of fracture, at that point of break, and that then becomes their whole identity.
Yeah, so it's extremely hard.
Which brings me back to the role of the church, right? Which is to say that we have a way to offer language for an identity that includes, but is more than that traumatic reality.
When it's done well.
Well, that's what we're doing here, right?
Yeah.
No, hopefully,
right.
When it's done well. I mean,
that's what it does.
But we have a story, right, of a crucified Savior that can hold trauma, and still be more than.
Yes, more than.
Right, and so I think one of the tasks ahead of us as we form leaders here, as our leaders go out into the world, is to think about what does it mean to embody. The crucified Savior as we contend with trauma.
Yep, that's true.
All right. I think that's our time. J. Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for those who joined us online. It's been a real joy to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, thank you.
And I do have books for sale. And I'm glad to sign any books out at the table. So,
all right. Thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you all so much.